Hi everyone, and welcome to this session. Why is no goal sometimes best goal? My name is Amarbeer Singh, and I used to have a background in secondary maths, but currently work in teacher education and professional development. When I was teaching, though, one of the challenges I would find was there would be specific types of problems that I'd give to my students, problems that I knew they could answer. I tested the underlying knowledge they needed, and I could see that they could get it correct. But despite having that secure underlying knowledge, they would really struggle with these types of problems. Let me show an example of what I mean. I'll give you a moment just to look at the question. You may wish to pause here. So this question involves using a few different rules of geometry to firstly find the required angle, and secondly, give an explanation as to why that's the case. And what used to confuse me wasn't just that I knew my students could do it but struggled to do so, it's that they would struggle to even make a start. In fact, sometimes their exact words would be, "So I don't even know where to begin." So today we're going to use this example to explore why this challenge occurs and one potential way we can navigate it. In order to do that first, we need to get to grips with some theory and specifically look at how we process information. This is an adapted version of the simple model of memory suggested by Professor Daniel Williams. And what he suggested is that we can think of memory being split up into two parts: working memory, which is where we think, we process information, and long-term memory, where we store information. Now, cognitive load theory suggests that working memory is incredibly limited. We can only handle what psychologists called 4 to 7 chunks of information at any given point in time. Long-term memory, on the other hand, as far as we're aware, has no upper limit. And although we've said that's where we store information, it's not a passive process. It's not like a filing cabinet or a hard drive, which we just put information onto and it just sits there. It actively supports some of those limitations of working memory. Let's do a quick experiment to help exemplify what I mean here. So, in a moment, I'm going to display 18 letters on the screen. I'm going to display them for 6 seconds and then take them away. And once I've taken them away, I want you to write down as many as you can remember in the order in which they were displayed. So, here we go. Okay, have a go at trying to write down as many as you can remember. You may wish to pause the video whilst you do this. We're going to do the exact same thing again, but this time I've changed the order of the letters very slightly, by no more than 2 spaces at most. Again, I'll show them for 6 seconds and give you an opportunity to write after I've taken them away. Here we go. Again, you may wish to pause the video whilst you write, because I'll now display the answers. So compare what's on the screen to what you were able to recall. And I'd encourage you to reflect on what I imagine was the result, which is that you probably found the second string of letters easier. You probably were able to recall more of them, and you're probably more successful. So I'll give you a moment now to think about, well, why might that have been the case? You may wish to pause here before I offer an explanation. So one of the critical features, as we said earlier, of long-term memory is that it is an active part of our memory system. It's not like a filing cabinet which we passively just put information onto. As this exercise demonstrates, it supports working memory. In that second string, we are unlikely to have processed those as 3 individual items of information. Instead, rather than reading that as CAT, we probably read it as cat, one item of information or one chunk of information. Whereas in the first string, we struggled to do that. We couldn't put together and add any meaning to CTA or ODG. We didn't have any prior knowledge which we could call upon to help with some of the limitations of working memory. So this is a key finding from cognitive load theory, that working memory is incredibly limited, but long-term memory can actively support it. We're not going to touch on long-term memory today, but we are going to look at a way we can support working memory and how that knowledge can help us make sense of why students struggled with that problem. Let's return to this idea of specific goals and non-specific goals by going back to the problem we looked at earlier. This question has a really specific goal: work out the size of angle X. Once a student reads that, what's likely to happen is they'll look for a path to finding X. The trouble with this question is the path is not immediately obvious. In fact, even the first step isn't immediately obvious, as there are multiple bits of additional information we need to find first, which will allow us to find a path to finding x. And then we actually need to do the maths to execute all of that working and find a final value for that missing angle. Now, this approach of thinking about the end point and trying to work backwards is called means end analysis. And this places a load on our thinking because we are having to process the end point, the starting point, how to get from the starting point to the end point, as well as the information from the question. The final thing is, alongside doing that, each time we do a step, we'll probably be processing, am I closer to my endpoint than I was before I just did this step? So this cognitive load is significant and often just too much. It's likely to result in students feeling overwhelmed and displaying opt-out behaviors, so giving up or a lack of trying or like visible signs of frustration. But what if there was no endpoint? Well, what Professor Sweller and his colleagues found was this. They put this to the test and removed the endpoints and created non-specific goals. In doing so, we remove the possibility of using a means-end strategy to solve problems. Instead, all students now have to process is the starting point of the question and the information from it. We've removed the requirement of having to figure out the endpoint, having to find paths to the endpoint, and having to constantly check whether the working we've done has got us any closer to the endpoint than before we did that working. So we've replaced a specific goal, for example, find X, with a non-specific goal, such as find as many of the missing angles as you can see. Going back to that question, we could amend it to look like this. And what I love about this strategy is that it's so time efficient. Like just a small tweak can make a huge difference. So instead of giving a really specific goal, you could remove the goal and instead say something like add as much information to the diagram as possible, or find as many missing angles as you possibly can. What's likely to happen is students will end up finding all of the missing angles, including the one that was the original goal in the first place. If they do that, I'd also highlight this to students. So after they've solved the problem and come to a solution, I'd remove the boxes and demonstrate how they might tackle a similar problem in the future and avoid using means end analysis. So saying something like, next time you're in a situation where you're not sure where to begin, remember that removing the goal and starting anywhere might be the best option. Let me share another example of what this could look like. This is another example of where saying something like add as much information as possible to this diagram might be useful, but there are some important considerations here first. Firstly, students might need some direction as to when to stop. With the previous question, there was a clear stopping point, which was when all of the missing angles were found. With this question, the stopping point is less clear-cut. We could stop after finding expressions for the missing sides, or expression for the perimeter, or for the area, or for all of the above. We need to be mindful that without a stopping rule, students might end up like sort of fumbling around in the dark trying to find something that doesn't exist, something that's probably not going to support their learning. This isn't to say that this approach is always beneficial, and we should be wary of some of the limitations of this approach, such as a stopping rule. Another limitation is that students must have the prerequisite knowledge and be fluent in using it. Returning to the previous example, it might look like this. So if students aren't familiar and fluent with using this prerequisite knowledge, they'll be trying to learn all of that prerequisite knowledge and apply it in this problem. This is going to place a significant load on their working memory, one that's likely to be overwhelming as their thinking is simply being spread too thin and there's too much to process in one go. Essentially, we'll be trying to build on incredibly shaky foundations and things are likely to come tumbling down. Another feature which might impact the success of this technique is applicability. Now, here's a situation where the approach of a non-specific goal or having a goal-free approach is unlikely to be of benefit. One of the reasons it worked well in those previous problems is because there wasn't necessarily a specific order in which we needed to complete the intermediate steps before finding that final solution. However, in this situation, the steps must be completed in a specific order for the correct answer to be reached. There is only one way to get the right answer, and so recommending a goal-free approach in this situation runs the risk of being detrimental to student learning rather than supporting it. So let's wrap things up with a summary of what we've covered. Firstly, the purpose of non-specific goals or goal-free type problems is to lessen the load on working memory. If the problems we share with students, when changing them into non-specific goal types or goal-free problems, don't lessen that load, then we're not making use of the benefits of these strategies. Secondly, as we said, students must be fluent and familiar with that prerequisite knowledge. There shouldn't be a singular defined path to success, and there should be a stopping rule. Or if there's not one already inbuilt in the question, we may have to add that in as teachers. Finally, once they have been successful, we should support students to reflect on their approach and how it may help them in situations in which they do have a specific goal. There are two bits of recommended reading here that I suggest. Firstly is a blog I've written for the EEF around this topic, which is that first QR code on the top right. And secondly, the paper from Professor John Sweller, in which he explores this in much greater detail, which is that QR code on the bottom right. Final thing to say is I'm always keen to carry on these conversations. So if you'd like to get in touch, please feel free to reach out to me on social media. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Thank you very much.